A rowdy tourist thought he could use his aggressive dog to intimidate a royal guard wielding fear as a form of control. But when he finally let the animal loose, he realized too late that the situation had turned against him. What happened next left the entire crowd in stunned silence. Here's how it all unfolded. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow at this same time, we'll bring you another powerful story highlighting the unwavering courage and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. You know, I've been telling stories for over 20 years now, and I've covered everything from heartwarming tales of redemption to the darkest corners of human nature. But this one still gives me chills every time I think about it. It happened on a crisp autumn morning in October 2023, right outside Buckingham Palace, and it involved a man who thought he could intimidate one of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. The thing about London is that it draws all kinds of people. You've got your typical tourists with their cameras and guidebooks, families trying to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard. And then you've got the others, the ones who seem to carry darkness with them wherever they go. Mark Davidson was definitely one of the others. I first heard about this incident from my contact at the Metropolitan Police, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen. She's been working the Westminster beat for 15 years, and she told me she'd never seen anything quite like what happened that day. The way she described it, it was like watching a collision between two different worlds, one built on chaos and intimidation, the other on discipline and honor. Mark Davidson wasn't your average troublemaker. At 42 years old, he'd already accumulated a rap sheet that read like a manual for antisocial behavior. Public disturbance, assault, property damage. The man had made a career out of making other people's lives miserable. But what made him particularly dangerous wasn't just his criminal record, it was his weapon of choice. Zeus wasn't just any dog. This 120-pound German Shepherd had been systematically trained to be aggressive, to intimidate, to attack on command. Mark had rescued him from a shelter 3 years earlier, but instead of giving the animal love and proper training, he'd turned him into an extension of his own twisted personality. Neighbors in Mark's Birmingham apartment complex had filed dozens of complaints about the dog's aggressive behavior, but somehow Mark had always managed to slip through the legal cracks. The morning started like any other at Buckingham Palace. Tourists were already gathering by 8 a.m., even though the changing of the guard wouldn't happen for another 3 hours. There's something magical about those early morning hours around the palace, the way the light hits the golden gates, the quiet anticipation of visitors from around the world, the sense that you're standing at the heart of something truly historic. Corporal James Blackwood had been on duty since 6 a.m. At 28 years old, he was a veteran of the Coldstream Guards, having served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. The man had seen combat, real combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Standing motionless outside Buckingham Palace might have seemed like a vacation compared to dodging IEDs in Helmand Province, but Blackwood understood something that most people don't sometimes. The hardest battles are the ones where you have to stand perfectly still. The Royal Guards aren't just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. These are active duty soldiers, many of them combat veterans, who've earned their position through years of rigorous training and service. They're taught to remain absolutely motionless and silent, no matter what happens around them. Tourists can shout, take photos, even try to make them laugh, but a true guardsman never breaks. It's a matter of honor, of discipline, of representing something greater than yourself. That morning, Blackwood had already dealt with the usual parade of tourists trying to get a reaction. A group of teenagers had spent 20 minutes making faces at him, a couple from Australia had posed for what felt like 100 photos, and at least 6 different children had asked their parents why the soldier statue wasn't moving. Through it all, Blackwood remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the distance, his breathing controlled, his mind focused. But then, around 9:30, the atmosphere changed. You know how sometimes you can feel trouble coming before you actually see it? That's exactly what happened. The crowd seemed to shift, people started moving away from a particular area, and there was this tension in the air that even the most oblivious tourists could sense. Mark Davidson emerged from the crowd like a shark cutting through water. He was about 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that came from years of manual labor and too much beer. His face was weathered and hard, with small eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for weakness in others. He wore a stained football jersey, ripped jeans, and boots that had seen better days. But the most intimidating thing about him wasn't his appearance. It was the massive German shepherd straining against a heavy chain leash at his side. Zeus was a beautiful dog, the kind that would have been magnificent if he'd been raised with love and proper training. His coat was thick and lustrous, his build powerful and athletic. But there was something wrong with his inner wildness, an aggression that made people instinctively step back. This wasn't a pet. This was a weapon that had been systematically conditioned to view the world as a threat. The crowd began to part as Mark swaggered through, Zeus growling low and menacing at anyone who came too close. A family from Japan quickly gathered there. Children had moved away. An elderly couple from Scotland hurried past, the woman clutching her husband's arm. Even the street performers who usually worked the area seemed to sense the danger and began packing up their equipment. Mark was feeding off the fear. You could see it in his face, the way his mouth curved into a cruel smile, the way his chest puffed out with false pride. This was his drug, his addiction, the power he felt when people were afraid of him and his dog. He'd pull on Zeus's leash just to make him lunge at passing tourists, laughing when they jumped back in terror. "What's wrong?" he called out to a group of college students who were trying to give him a wide berth. Afraid of a little puppy, he yanked the chain, making Zeus snap at the air, his teeth gleaming in the morning sun. The students quickened their pace, and Mark's laughter followed them. But then his eyes landed on something that made his smile falter for just a moment. There, standing perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, was Corporal Blackwood. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the commotion, hadn't even seemed to notice the approaching threat. To Mark, this was both insulting and irresistible. You have to understand Mark's psychology to appreciate what happened next. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life dominating others through fear and intimidation. He'd been kicked out of school for bullying, fired from multiple jobs, for aggressive behavior, and had a string of failed relationships with women who eventually couldn't take his controlling nature. The only constant in his life was his ability to make people afraid of him and his dog. But here was this soldier, this representative of everything Mark despised about authority and order, completely ignoring him. It was like a red flag to a bull. Mark's entire identity was built on being the most dangerous person in any room, and this guard was treating him like he was invisible. "Hey," Mark called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Yeah, you in the funny hat, I'm talking to you." He began walking toward Blackwood, Zeus straining against the leash, sensing his master's agitation. The crowd around them began to thin out even more, people instinctively understanding that they didn't want to be anywhere near whatever was about to happen. Blackwood, of course, didn't respond. His training was absolute. He'd been taught to ignore everything hecklers, photographers, even genuine emergencies if they occurred outside his specific area of responsibility. His job was to stand guard, to represent the crown, to embody the discipline and honor of the British military. Breaking that concentration, even for a moment, would be a betrayal of everything he'd sworn to uphold. Mark stopped about 10 feet away from the guard. Zeus, now barking intermittently, his aggressive energy feeding off his master's rising anger. "What's the matter, tin soldier? Too important to talk to regular people." Mark's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. A few tourists were starting to take out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. The thing about bullies is that they're fundamentally cowards. They pick on people they think can't or won't fight back. Mark had spent years terrorizing ordinary citizens, people who had no training in conflict resolution, no experience with real violence. But Corporal Blackwood wasn't ordinary. He was a combat veteran who'd faced down Taliban fighters and IED explosions. A loudmouthed tourist with a badly trained dog wasn't even registering as a threat. Mark's frustration was mounting by the second. He'd built his entire reputation on being able to intimidate anyone, and this guard was treating him like he didn't exist. The crowd was watching now, phones out, some people even starting to look, amused by the one-sided confrontation. Mark could feel his authority slipping away, and that made him dangerous. "You think you're better than me," Mark snarled, stepping closer. Zeus was now in full aggressive mode, barking and lunging at the end of his chain. "You think that costume makes you tough?" He was maybe 6 feet away from Blackwood now, close enough that spittle from his angry words might have reached the guard's face. Still, Blackwood didn't move. His breathing remained steady, his eyes fixed on that distant point. his entire body radiating the kind of calm that only comes from years of disciplined training. This wasn't stubbornness or arrogance, this was a man who understood his duty and was absolutely committed to fulfilling it. Detective Inspector Chen later told me that this was the moment when things could have gone very differently. If Mark had just been a loud drunk tourist, the situation might have eventually diffused itself. Security would have shown up, Mark would have been escorted away, and that would have been the end of it. But Mark wasn't just drunk on alcohol, he was drunk on power, on the need to dominate, and he couldn't handle being ignored. "Fine," Mark said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you won't talk to me, maybe you'll talk to Zeus." He began fumbling with the chain leash, and that's when some of the smarter tourists realized what was about to happen and started backing away quickly. The thing about attack dogs is that they're not born aggressive, they're made that way. Zeus had been systematically trained to view strangers as threats, to respond to his master's commands with immediate violence. But underneath all that conditioning, he was still just a dog, a pack animal, who'd been taught that aggression was the only way to please his alpha. Mark's fingers worked at the heavy clip that held Zeus's chain. "Let's see how still you stand when Zeus goes for your throat," he muttered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. There were gasps, someone screamed, and at least 3 people started dialing emergency numbers on their phones. The moment Mark released that chain, everything changed. Zeus, freed from his restraint, immediately focused on the target his master had been threatening. To the dog, this was what he'd been trained for: eliminate the threat, please the pack leader, do what he'd been conditioned to do since he was a puppy. The crowd scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Parents grabbed their children, tourists dove behind barriers, and even some of the street vendors who'd been working the area ran for cover. In the space of about 3 seconds, a busy courtyard had become a battlefield, with only 3 participants: Mark, Zeus, and Corporal Blackwood. Zeus launched himself at the guard with all the power and aggression that a trained attack dog could muster. His teeth were bared, his eyes were wild, and he was moving with the kind of focused violence that would have terrified anyone who wasn't prepared for it. But here's what Mark didn't understand about Corporal Blackwood. This wasn't just some ceremonial soldier playing dress-up for tourists. This was a man who'd survived firefights in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. He'd been trained not just in military protocol, but in hand-to-hand combat, in threat assessment, in the kind of split-second decision-making that keeps you alive when bullets are flying. The guard's response was so fast, so precise, that most of the witnesses didn't even see exactly what happened. One moment Zeus was airborne, teeth aimed at Blackwood's throat. The next moment, the dog was on the ground, whimpering, completely neutralized but unharmed. What Blackwood had done was something called a redirection technique, a method of dealing with aggressive animals that neutralizes the threat without causing permanent damage. As Zeus lunged, Blackwood had sidestepped with perfect timing, grabbed the dog's collar, and used the animal's own momentum to redirect him safely to the ground. It was like watching a master martial artist deal with an untrained opponent, efficient, controlled, and completely devastating. Mark's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession: confusion, rage, disbelief, and finally, a kind of desperate fury that made him even more dangerous. His weapon, his symbol of power, his guarantee of dominance, had been neutralized by a man who hadn't even broken his stoic expression. "You hurt my dog," Mark roared, charging forward with his fists raised. But if he thought he was going to catch Blackwood off guard, he was about to learn another painful lesson. The guard had been trained to deal with multiple threats, and an out-hoved shape, middle-aged man with anger management issues wasn't exactly a challenge. Before Mark could take more than 2 steps, 2 more guards appeared as if from nowhere. Thing about the Royal Guard is that they work as a team. When one guard is threatened, the others respond immediately. These weren't ceremonial soldiers, they were active-duty military personnel with radios, backup, and very specific protocols for dealing with threats. Mark found himself face-to-face with 2 more combat veterans, both of them moving with the kind of controlled aggression that comes from years of professional training. Unlike Mark's wild, emotional violence, these men represented disciplined force, the kind that's infinitely more dangerous because it's completely under control. The sirens were already wailing in the distance. Someone in the crowd had called the police within seconds of Zeus being released, and the Metropolitan Police don't mess around when it comes to threats near royal properties. Mark was about to discover that assaulting a royal guard carries significantly more serious consequences than intimidating random tourists. "You can't do this," Mark screamed as the guards restrained him. "That soldier attacked us. He hurt my dog." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd had seen everything. Dozens of phones had recorded the incident, and the truth was painfully obvious to everyone except Mark himself. Zeus, meanwhile, was being approached by a specialist from the Metropolitan Police's dog unit. Unlike Mark, this officer understood that the dog was as much a victim as anyone else. Zeus hadn't chosen to be trained as a weapon. He'd been systematically conditioned to behave aggressively by an owner who saw him as a tool rather than a living being. The police response was swift and professional. Within minutes, the scene was crawling with officers, animal control specialists, and emergency medical personnel. Mark, still ranting about his rights and threatening lawsuits, was efficiently handcuffed and loaded into a police van. His protests grew more desperate as he realized that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working on people who dealt with actual dangerous criminals on a daily basis. Detective Inspector Chen was one of the first senior officers on the scene. She'd been working a nearby case when the call came in about an assault on a royal guard, and she'd immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Attacks on royal guards are treated as threats to national security, and the full weight of the legal system comes down on perpetrators. The man was completely delusional. Chen told me later, he seemed to genuinely believe that he was the victim, that somehow the guard had attacked him. He kept screaming about police brutality and his rights, but he'd just released a trained attack dog on a soldier in front of dozens of witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Zeus's situation was more complicated. The dog was clearly dangerous, but animal control specialists could see that his aggression was learned behavior rather than innate viciousness. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a veterinary behaviorist who was called to assess the situation, later explained that Zeus showed classic signs of systematic abuse disguised as training. "This wasn't a naturally aggressive dog," Dr. Matthews told me. "This was an animal that had been systematically conditioned to view the world as threatening. The owner had essentially weaponized what should have been a loyal family pet. It was actually heartbreaking to see." The decision was made to remove Zeus from Mark's custody permanently. The dog would be taken to a specialized facility where experts would work to undo years of harmful conditioning. It would be a long process, but there was hope that Zeus could eventually be rehabilitated and placed with a family that would treat him properly. As for Corporal Blackwood, he had resumed his post as if nothing had happened. His uniform was still immaculate, his posture still perfect, his expression still stoically neutral. The only sign that anything unusual had occurred was the slight dampness on his gloves where he'd briefly handled Zeus during the incident. The legal consequences for Mark Davidson were severe. Assault on a royal guard, reckless endangerment, public disorder, and animal cruelty charges were just the beginning. The Crown Prosecution Service treated the case as a serious threat to public safety, and Mark's extensive criminal record ensured that he wouldn't be receiving any leniency from the courts. During the trial, which took place 3 months later, the prosecution presented a devastating case. They had multiple video recordings from tourist phones, testimony from dozens of witnesses, an expert analysis of Zeus's condition that painted a clear picture of systematic animal abuse. Mark's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been provoked by the guard's aggressive silence, but the judge wasn't having any of it. "Mr. Davidson," the judge said during sentencing, "you brought a weapon that is what you had turned this poor animal into a crowded public space and deliberately used it to attack a member of Her Majesty's forces. This was not a moment of passion or poor judgment. This was a calculated act of violence that endangered countless innocent people." Mark was sentenced to 3 years in prison, banned from owning animals for life, and required to pay substantial compensation to cover Zeus's rehabilitation costs. Even after his release, he would be prohibited from entering the area around Buckingham Palace, and any future criminal activity would result in enhanced penalties due to his status as a repeat offender. The case became something of a sensation. In the British media, "Tourist's dog attack backfires," spectacularly read one headline. "Royal Guard shows true meaning of discipline," read another. But beyond the sensationalism, the incident had exposed some serious issues about animal welfare and the problem of people who weaponize pets for intimidation. Corporal Blackwood, true to military tradition, declined all interview requests and never made any public statements about the incident. His commanding officer later said that the guard had performed exactly as trained, and that his actions were a credit to the regiment. For Blackwood, it was just another day at work though, probably more eventful than most. The story of Zeus's rehabilitation became almost as compelling as the original incident. Dr. Matthews and her team worked for months to undo the damage that Mark had inflicted on the dog's psyche. It was a slow, patient process that required enormous skill and dedication. The first challenge was getting Zeus to trust humans again. Dr. Matthews explained. He'd been taught that people were either threats to be attacked or pack leaders to be feared. Teaching him that humans could be sources of love and security was like starting from scratch with a fully grown, traumatized animal. The process involved careful desensitization, positive reinforcement training, and a lot of patience. Zeus had to learn that aggression wouldn't be rewarded, that other dogs weren't automatically enemies, and that the world wasn't as dangerous as he'd been taught to believe. It was heartbreaking work, but gradually, the real dog began to emerge from under years of conditioning. After 8 months of intensive rehabilitation, Zeus was ready for adoption. The family that took him in was carefully selected dog owners who understood his history and were committed to continuing his recovery. They renamed him Max, gave him a loving home, and slowly helped him discover what it meant to be a pet rather than a weapon. The last I heard, Max was doing well. He'd learned to play fetch, had made friends with the neighbor's cat, and showed no signs of his former aggression. It was a remarkable transformation that proved something important, that with patience, skill, and love, even the most damaged beings can be healed. Mark Davidson, meanwhile, served his full sentence and was released quietly in 2026. He'd been required to attend anger management classes and animal welfare education programs while in prison, but those who knew him doubted that he'd learned much from the experience. Some people, unfortunately, seem incapable of change. As I finish telling this story, I'm struck by what it reveals about human nature. We saw the worst of it in Mark Davidson, a man so consumed by his need to dominate others that he turned a beautiful animal into a weapon. We saw the best of it in Corporal Blackwood, a professional who did his duty with skill and honor, protecting both the public and ultimately even the dog that attacked him. But perhaps the most important lesson comes from Zeus's story. It reminds us that aggression and violence are usually learned behaviors, not innate traits. The dog that was trained to attack became a loving family pet when given the chance. It makes you wonder what Mark Davidson might have been like if he'd been raised with love and proper guidance instead of whatever twisted his soul so badly. The incident at Buckingham Palace lasted less than 5 minutes, but its consequences rippled outward for years. It changed lives, exposed important social issues, and ultimately reminded us all that actions have consequences, sometimes more severe than we ever imagined. Corporal Blackwood went on to complete his service with distinction and eventually left the military to pursue a career in security consulting. He never spoke publicly about that October morning, but his actions spoke louder than any words could have. He'd shown the world what true strength looks like, not the loud, violent posturing of a bully, but the quiet, controlled power of a trained professional doing his job. And somewhere in suburban London, a dog named Max is probably curled up on a couch, dreaming peaceful dreams, finally free from the nightmare that Mark Davidson had created for him. That, perhaps, is the most important victory of all. The tourists still gather at Buckingham Palace every day, and the guards still stand their silent vigil, but those who witnessed what happened that October morning will never forget the lesson they learned, that true power lies not in intimidation or aggression, but in discipline, honor, and the quiet strength to do what's right, even when no one's watching. The story ends there, but the lessons it teaches us will continue long after the last tourist has gone home and the last guard has completed his duty. Some stories are worth remembering, not just for their drama, but for the truths they reveal about who we are and who we can choose to become.